Welcome to How Good's Innovation Online series. This is part of an ongoing series focused on regenerative agriculture, biodiversity, and planetary health. So, How Good's Biodiversity Online, Biodiversity, Regenerative Agriculture, and Planetary Health. Today we have the great joy of talking with Rebecca Burgess from Fibershed. And we'll dive into that in a minute. Let me just first tell you about some upcoming events that we have. We're going to be focusing on a good bit of regenerative agriculture and moving into some other realms. Early in August, Steve Jay from General Mills will be joining us to talk about the regenerative agriculture work they've been doing on larger scale farms across the US and beyond. Then we'll have Jane from NUMI joining us to talk about regenerative packaging and what does that even look like? Could that even be a thing? How do we get there? And then finally, Jesse Smith and Lauren Tucker from the White Buffalo Land Trust will be sharing a bit about how they've done some regenerative product development, and then also likely talking about a very exciting new regenerative agriculture center that they are developing. So that's what's coming up next. The basic outline for today, we're gonna be focusing on fiber and textiles and fashion. The overview is we'll do a quick intro that we're in now. Rebecca and I will have a conversation for 30 minutes or so. We'll do some quick interactive community breakouts so you can generate questions, meet each other, say hello, and then we'll come back together to wrap things up for Q&A. So without further ado, I will stop sharing screen and say welcome, Rebecca. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thank you, Ethan. Nice to actually operationalize more of our conversations via Zoom these days. It's good. I'm glad for it.
So I don't know, I put a post on LinkedIn today. It was basically saying sustainable fashion isn't enough. Maybe we could do a regenerative fashion. Is that even possible? What would it look like? Do you think that's possible? And how might we get there? I don't know, kick us off in that direction towards an actual regenerative industry that's outside of food, because we've spent a lot of time on food. So what would regenerative fashion look like? Is it possible? How do we get there?
Great question. Yes, totally possible. And I guess it would be helpful to start with the way I define regeneration, which has broadened as I've delved into the work. But my primary thought and feeling about regeneration is the ability for self-renewal, the ability for like when our bodies are ailing or we get a cut and our body is able to repair that without us necessarily consciously going in and trying to fix it ourselves, that there's these processes that are innate and part of the automaticity of our own life experience. So we experience regeneration in our bodies consistently, but we don't always, when we think about land and land management, we often don't think about that these landscapes in agriculture have the capability for self-renewal, and because there's such highly, there's a lot of biophobia in agriculture. A colleague used that term yesterday, like even in organic agriculture, they don't want insects crawling up the grass into the citrus. You have to keep your grass height just a certain height to manage, this highly managed thing that's really a dynamic whole system. That's a citrus orchard, a vineyard, a irrigated landscape producing cotton. These are highly managed systems, but they have the ability for self-renewal, meaning we don't need to bring in necessarily synthetic nitrogen into the system. We don't need to bring in the kinds of pest management, synthetic pest management, synthetic weed management that we have been. There are, of course, systems primarily modeled by indigenous communities, place-based communities for millennia, that have allowed self-renewal processes to take place. So in this colonial, we're still living in lands that have been, I'm living on unceded territory, occupying unceded territories. So we do have that part of regeneration to look at, which is land access, who's on the land, how are we regenerating whole communities so that we can allow land to self-renew, because the economy is structured in a way that makes it, in many ways, difficult to do some of the things we're attempting to do, which would be to regenerate ourselves and the landscapes simultaneously. It has to come together. And it's not just about self, it's about self within a community. And we have a lot of things we need to repair social culturally as well. So fashion has to contend with all of that. Fashion has to contend with its colonial roots. Fashion has to contend not with the cotton plant necessarily or the indigo, but the ways in which land was grabbed to be able to grow those cash crops, and who was forced into labor that was unpaid to accrue wealth for certain individuals to launch the textile and fashion systems historically in North America. Those are all things we need to look at and contend with. And so for me, I think, yes, we can do this, and we just have to thoughtfully and carefully step forward. And one of the things I guess I could sum up with this is I've been coming to this sensibility that production-centered conversations have not necessarily, they've been basically left out. Like sustainability conversations or regenerative conversations in the fashion industry have tended to come from sustainability indexes designed by people at the white collar level or the upper end of the marketing side of the supply chain. What we're trying to do, I think, what I see as important is defining regeneration at the farm level. Let the farm level decide what is going to work for it. Where is the sovereignty and the agency to decide how we're going to regenerate? Instead of certifications coming from on high, coming from the brands or the NGOs, how are we letting communities make decisions about what fashion looks like? And we could answer that in many different ways, but ultimately I see the future as a production-centered conversation. Who are the actual producers? And what say do they have in wages? What say do they have to land access, land tenure? What say do they have in their culture of tending landscapes? And how does their definition of regeneration influence and define what we think of as regeneration when we pick up a shirt that we want to buy and see the tag with an ingredients list? Those pieces of regeneration should be defined by the communities producing this, not necessarily the people marketing the shirt.
Oh, wait, can't we just put compost on the soil, or like do some no-till and just do some, like, isn't there a checklist of regenerative practices I could just use and then we're all done?
Yeah, I used to think that way. And then, yes, and yeah, I think that those practices are still centered in our work: no-till, riparian corridor restoration, compost applications on rangelands, silvopasture, critical planting areas, shelter belts, windbreaks, the 35 Natural Resource Conservation Service practices that we've modeled at, what Colorado State University has modeled to show that they all have a greenhouse gas signature, meaning a drawdown signature. Oh yeah, I mean, we're using every tool we have, government, land grant universities, but I do definitely think that we have a culture that hasn't been tending landscapes very thoughtfully, even though we have all these parts and pieces we can put together with the current system. My ultimate question is, how do we give people the time and the economic space to tend to things? Mm-hmm. And that seems to have been left out of the conversation, because everything is about faster and more. And I'm not sure ultimately that the deeper forms of regeneration can happen. You can't speed up the healing of a cut on your hand. It's going to happen in the time it happens. And so we have to harmonize with that time frame.
Mm. And yet so I agree very much. And being a farmer myself, have some experience of just I grow apples, and I learn a lot every year, but it's taken years and years and years to get towards regenerative apple production, and I'm still not there yet. And so I agree a lot with the time frame, and yet you have developed an organization, a movement, and a set of work that has harmonized and worked with some really significant companies who do want to move fast, and who do, like, their marketing departments are excited about regenerative fiber, regenerative textiles, regenerative fashion. So I don't know, maybe just if you have an interesting example from that realm that you are allowed to talk about, something that you've done and how you've kind of harmonized what you are speaking to with the pace of development that we see in the business world.
That's a great question. And the marketing community and the demand side of this conversation are critical. I think what's just been needed to occur is a stronger translator between, what needs to happen at the farm or ranch level, and what can be marketed and what should be marketed, and how to approach the marketing of regeneration. So that's a lot of the conversation that I have, because these textiles we're developing are not on demand. You actually kind of have to build a relationship with the land base and the community in that land base to develop these materials. It's becoming more efficient in a good way, not efficiency that's masking true work, but efficiencies are occurring. But the work we started with was with the VF Corporation, and they own Timberland, North Face, Vans, JanSport, and they have been wonderfully committed to work at the level of the ranch level. So we worked with them, and we continue to every year. They are, through their corporate social responsibility arm, funding work at the ranch level where they're sourcing their wool from. And that work to source wool from a ranch had not been done before. So, getting to know a rancher at that level, and being able to source. And of course, this was a large scale ranch. So it was a great match between some larger scale land base and a larger scale corp. Koyuchi, a wonderful bedding company, has worked directly with wool that was considered a byproduct, meaning fiber continuously just gets thrown aside, but still in the food-centric world of, like, how are we going to regenerate land? Well, we do it through the food system. And I would argue we do it through the food, fiber, fuel, flora system. We have to think about things at least as complexly as agribusiness is thinking about it. We better be on our game if we're going to do this work. So I have seen Koyuchi take wool that was being thrown away and actually utilize it for durable goods that supplanted reliance on other materials that had fossil carbon derived or down, which has some animal welfare concerns. So using wool for mattress toppers, using it in pillows, using it in dryer balls, and again, wool that was too coarse and was getting thrown away. Frankenmuth Mill in Michigan, I think it's the oldest wool mill in the United States. They have started to work with ranchers directly in our program. And our program is really focused on getting price premiums for this material and channeling 100% of the dollars, whether the company donates that money, or they include it in the price of the per pound rate of the raw material. 100% of those dollars go back, but are earmarked for native plants, compost, fencing, irrigation systems, whatever the producer needs, a supporting practice or direct practice to restore land.
And have you found that there's, have longer term agreements or contracts been part of this for one way to drive it is, like you're saying, to add the premiums and say, hey, these premiums are coming in, they're for you, and they're for you to do this supportive work. It sounds like, the way you described it, that is also in line with what the farmers and ranchers themselves want to be doing. So that's one way to do it. Another way is to sort of say, like we agree to purchase this fiber being produced in a regenerative way over a longer term or with a longer contract. Has that entered into conversations? Do you think farmers want that? Do you think that's a possible and useful route to be exploring?
Oh, we have in the fashion realm, that's the other production-centered conversation bullet point that needs to be at the needs to be at a high commitment level for the marketers, but they're not in the fiber system. We're not seeing multi-year contracts yet, and that is really difficult because every year, you know, and I'm used to it because of the way I work entrepreneurially. I'm like, I don't know what's coming 3 months from now. And I think farmers too are unfortunately used to that. But again, if you get back to that question of how do we incentivize tending a culture where people are invested in the land because they know they're going to be there, and our human time frame is so much shorter than Earth process time frames, you know, we really do, if our hands are going to get in there and do good work, we do need guarantees as humans we're going to be on that land base. And even in California, we can't even do work on land until the rainy season starts. So we have these little optimal moments within the year. And so you need multiple years to manifest good work. So that is something that I've been, you know, rallying for. But I think especially with COVID and the absolute crash of retail markets and large textile companies going bankrupt like dominoes right now, where multi-year contracts are not the top of the conversation at the moment. I think we'll return to that when some things level out, and we'll see who's left after this situation.
What would you say, we titled this conversation Regenerative Fiber. What fibers do you think have the greatest potential to be regenerative or to get there at a sooner time frame that would be able to be a reasonable supply for textile or the fashion industry? What are some of the different, maybe on the animal side, on the plant side, that you feel like are places we might start or sort of hone in on, either because they're almost ready and they're there and we can kind of, you know, expand, or there are things that are somehow like an acupuncture point where working on this particular crop would actually make things possible for some other crops in the system?
That is such a great question. Our strategy has been to work with the low-hanging fruit fibers that exist in the community already. And part of the reason for that, and that has been wool and cotton, because they already exist here and they're already in crop rotations, and they have potential. Again, it's not the plant or the animal that is necessarily, when we think of agriculture and how we're going to solve, you know, people tend to demonize cotton crops. They just kind of go after the cotton, like Gossypium barbidens is not your problem. It's, you know, that, or Gossypium hirsutum, not your problem. The problem is the system that is producing that species and the kinds of inputs. So we've gone after kind of like deconstruct the relationship between the plant itself and the cropping system. And we've been tackling what in the cropping system can we tweak? Can we move to multi-species cover crop in the winter and plant the cash crop in the tomato cotton cycle, because it's cotton, tomato, but we have fallow ground in the winter. Can we interject a multi-species cover crop? We're working on that. We have trial sites. Can we put cotton in an agroforestry system? Can we hedge olive trees and mulberry that can grow in our saline soils, which are being destroyed in the San Joaquin Valley, and still have enough space for a cotton harvester, at least a small one, to get through those rows of trees? Can we run animals, because cotton is not a food crop, we don't fall under the same food security rules, which are intense in orchard systems, intense in row crop for food production systems. Can we move animals through the stubble to defoliate the cotton without using Roundup?
Wow.
So there are ways in which cotton, because I spent time in indigenous communities that are growing cotton in beautiful ways, I was like, I'm not gonna just let people throw this crop out with the, baby does not go out with the bathwater. You have to approach the plant and think about what system would support this plant to be grown well. That's the question. And same with wool, it's like, sure, some parts of the world people probably they are putting animals in containment, very rare in sheep cases, but there are, questions people have about contained animal feeding operations for sheep. And I'm like, well, it doesn't really exist in the West of the United States at all. They're grass-fed and finished animals in our community. And the beautiful thing about the sheep and the wool production is that it can be not about ranches eating up virgin ecosystems for more grazing land, which is commonly another thing. Well, people think Amazon, rainforest is coming down, ruminants are being sent in, bad. And I'm like, context. You're in the western part of the US. There's systems that need to be grazed. And if you rewild some of these areas, you have a whole suite of logistics to contend with that I don't think most urban people are ready for. So we've been saying, what is the role of an herbivore in these rangelands? Not sheep, cow, goat, elk, pronghorn, antelope, just what's the role of the herbivore? And can we look at the herbivore to serve these hydrologic functional needs, these soil carbon organic needs? So how do we move the animals through the system? And one of the things we're realizing is the cropland system. So the 800,000 acres of vineyard in California are managed primarily with Roundup. There's Roundup in the organic wine because it's casting over into organic landscapes. So with that said, we've been finding that there's beautiful alternatives to Roundup, AKA sheep mowers. And so how do you produce on 1 acre of land your wine, your wool, your lamb, possibly cheese, if you were doing it very carefully? You could be growing other crops in between the vineyard system, not just multi-species cover. You could have other cash crops in there like wheat. You could graze the wheat down mid-cycle before it grows into fluorescence with the sheep. There's so many options to stack food, fiber, and dye and medicine on 1 acre of land, with wool as being an incredible, I guess, product of this integrated stacked function system. And we have that going on right now at a small scale.
Amazing.
So yes, wool and cotton don't have to be bad. And yes, the last thing I'll say is flax. Flax is a really exceptionally exciting plant, and we are so excited to see growers bringing it back. It doesn't need as much retting or degumming as hemp. Hemp is beautiful. I love hemp. It has a lot of lignin and pectin. Those are the two things that make it hard to degum. But there's some great companies like Agroloop working on this thing called a biorefinery, which uses the plant's own biochemistry to help degum the lignin and the pectin from the hemp. They're also using agricultural, they call it waste, but I don't, they're using agricultural product that is generally burned in fields. Agroloop is trying to use rice straw and banana and other materials to create a degummed fiber that could be blended with cotton. It could be blended with wool. So there are innovators. Agroloop, being Circular Systems, is a company we've been really pleased to see on the landscape, and they're at the R&D scale in many cases. So that's like the acupuncture point. I would definitely go in and help fund and support their work to expand. Mm-hmm. And I would work with the flax growers as well, again, because there's not as much chemistry needed to soften flax. And it's such an heirloom textile that you can wear for decades and even give to your kids. And it's it's really got heirloom quality. And flax can grow over the winter in California, and it can grow in the Rogue River Valley in Oregon in the summer. So you could have people using equipment to harvest in areas that are only like 8 or 9 hours apart, but you could share equipment across landscapes because different people have different times of year they would grow the crop. And then we could do the sketching and hackling all in one area, and probably the wet spinning also all in one area. And we're looking at investing in that through our nonprofit.
Oh, fascinating. So I have a couple kind of question directions I want to go on that, but also just a note. We grow flax on a very small scale on our farm from indigenous Greek source that was found through my wife's lineage when we went looking for our ancestral fiber plants, and we found the last guy on this like out of the way island in all of Greece who was saving seed from this really ancient flax plant. And she's incredible, a beautiful plant. So I think it's really exciting that you're seeing the potential and tying that to the long-term heirloom quality of it. A question towards infrastructure is one of it, and sort of we talked with Gina from Applegate in an earlier conversation here about what investments need to be made in infrastructure. Is that a sort of little leverage point that if there was a wool mill that did something different, or some of the machinery you were talking about, is that a useful place that we should be looking? So let's do that one first, and I've got one other to follow that up.
Oh my gosh, infrastructure. Yes, it's pretty much all I think about. Yes, to make any of these landscape level changes viable, to have them be climate beneficial from the point at which we're growing them, to treat our farms and ranches like net sinks for carbon, for water, those landscapes can do that, and we're watching those transitions happen. But then we're harvesting, and the wool needs to go to China, the hides need to go to China. In all seriousness, like, even if we wanted to wash our wool in California, we have to ship it 5,000 miles. The closest washing station that can also comb it is in South Carolina. So most of it just goes overseas, because the diesel truck transport across the country is also expensive and polluting. And we use the South Carolina facilities for now, but it's less than optimal from a climate standpoint. So to truly have this work, the infrastructure has to be decentralized. In California, we have some great articles on this that just came out. We've launched something called the Regional Fiber Manufacturing Initiative. So on Fibershed's blog, we have roadmapped all the mills that exist in the West. We have roadmapped, what's the existing infrastructure. We've roadmapped where all the production of fiber is, and you can see all the highlights of where the cotton is and where the wool is. We've also analyzed how to develop textile districts inspired by the Carolina Textile District, which is a co-op that started with a coordinator. So as brands say, hey, I want to reshore, I really want to pull my production back to the United States. That is a complex set of supply chain relationships to coordinate. You need a coordinator. So the Carolina group, who still, after the North American Free Trade Agreement, of course, mills were decimated, but there's more milling infrastructure in the Carolinas really than anywhere in the United States. They retained a beautiful nugget of function. And so they have a coordinator who helps people understand how to move through the supply chain all the way through the cut and sew, and they're a co-op. And they're wonderful. So we were thinking, gosh, why don't we emulate the Carolina Textile District and do a Pacific Northwest Textile District? And then you could have, central western states with their own textile district, because there's a beautiful mill in Wyoming already that we work with. We're thinking, these districts could have coordinators so that every time a brand needs to work with a certain vision they want to work with, Montana wool, or they want to work with California Corriedale wool. Because again, there's a terroir to each of these regions and what they produce. So the textiles will reflect the endemic nature of place, but they can really only do that well when the manufacturing is centered with the actual growing. Because what happens when you send your wool to a centralized facility, it all gets mixed together. You can't even send black wool into the system at all. So all the opportunities for growing your color on the back of the animal or in the blossom of the flower, that color that comes from the land naturally, that we always come and put synthetic chemistry on to dye something that's white, all of that natural endemic color doesn't get seen in large scale throughout the system of, like, if you go to the store, it doesn't, it's like, this color was grown in the field. Like, that's not really something you have access to. But that could be something you have access to when we start to decentralize the manufacturing systems. So our regional fiber manufacturing initiative is looking at scaling 2 to 5 businesses in the $2 to $5 million range each between January and March of 2021. And we're looking at co-locating the wool washing with potentially the degumming of the bast fibers with the natural dyes, but also lifting up existing entrepreneurs. We're not coming in and saying, we're gonna put these mills into the community. We've done all this research to find out who wants to run the businesses, who's already running a business and wants to scale it. So the work is to uplift who's here, and that's what we're doing. It's kind of like an incubator for textile manufacturers.
And this leads very well to my other question, which is your knowledge of place and literally the fiber shed, the manufacturing, the growing in your place is so detailed. To what extent does regenerative fiber or regenerative fashion need to have that regionalized or localized sensibility, awareness? You're talking about almost the terroir, like they talk about with wine, but for color or for texture.
Yeah.
Do we need to, is that part of your image of a regenerative system for textiles, is that sensibility, that knowledge, that infrastructure would exist place to place around the US, around the world?
Yes, because that's what it was before we started using speculative capital to kind of run our economy in this system of like, take resources from one place and violently extract them to a place where, like, Manchester, England will move all the Indian cotton to Manchester, England, will metabolize it into textile and will sell it back to the people in India, who for millennia had been producing higher quality endemic textiles for themselves. So the only reason we're in this place of monolithic centralization that's highly brittle under climate chaos and highly brittle under pandemics, it's falling apart. Everyone's bankrupt in 3 months? How durable of a textile system? Not everyone, but there's an onslaught of bankruptcies that show me that this system is not being designed for sustainability. It's not being designed to last. It's speculative. It's short term. It's chaotic. It's exploitative. So the vision I'm putting forward is one of durability. It's one of what used to be here before we thought we could just extract from everywhere we go, which is for whatever reason, a very dominant narrative that we've seen in many industries. And so the question is just, how do we blend a modern sense of we do have incredible, wonderful technologies. So how do you take the indigenous place-based heartbeat that every human is tethered to and combine that with appropriate open source technologies that every community can have access to? You don't actually need to modify the technology so much between communities. Like, you all need to degum the hemp. You all really will need to wash the wool. And you'll need to do that in a decentralized manner. So those technologies, like I say, they're wonderful. We need them, absolutely. And we need more advanced technologies in some of these processing units. But we also can't, the model in which we access technology has to be, like, communities need to, like, there's so many models of technology. I like distributed ownership, where you don't really own the equipment, you kind of lease it long term. Because the equipment parts keep changing all the time, and the head company keeps innovating, and so they want to keep giving you the best form of the technology. I've looked at distributed technology models, I've looked at franchising, licensing models, and it's all challenging when you have a low margin business. Mm-hmm. So I'm trying to figure out what technology we could use that's stable enough that it's not going to keep needing new parts all the time.
Right.
And we can sit on like something we could at least use for 10 to 15 years without having to, go back and find the next best, greatest thing. That's the art right now, because technology is generally funded by venture capital, and it needs to keep having a planned obsolescence model for itself so it can keep making money. And communities are like, we can't keep paying you. Like, we just need something that washes our wool, please.
Right.
So we got to figure some things out, but it's possible.
If you have questions for Rebecca, you could take yourself off mute and ask them, or you could type them in the chat. But let's open up the floor from Lauren. Okay, Lauren, why don't you just take yourself off mute and ask that question? It's such a good one.
Great, thank you. So Rebecca, at the very beginning of the talk, you mentioned that really important part of this work is to understand that the land that we use in food and fiber and all of these other industries is stolen and historically had forced labor. And recognizing that is a really important part, but I'm wondering what practices or what steps you found to be important in your business with contending with that and like honoring that history in the current work that you do now.
That's a exquisitely complex process, I would say, because I still feel like I have a foot in both worlds, where I have a foot in the world of pretty large scale landowners who are actually in so many ways doing really good work and trying in their way the best that they can to do things that we talked about related to like literally regenerative land management practice. But then in terms of the unceded lands, what I'm starting with, we just did a lot of work on this, and we're doing actually a strategic plan for the next 6 months specifically on this. So in the immediate sense, we have put on our board the chairman of sacred sites for the Grayton Rancheria. So we have in leadership on our board someone who understands our particular geography and the 13,000-year history of the indigenous communities and what his particular tribe, their practices related to basketry, natural medicine, tool development. And what we are also doing is we're using our funding and moving our funding out to help support conversations that maybe we shouldn't be leading ourselves, because we are still, as staff, primarily white-led staff. We're looking at changing some of the leadership on our board, though, at the highest level of power for our org. What we can do is starting to put board members together that can help us sensitively identify the options for what we can do. So we don't own land ourselves. Fibershed doesn't own any land. So what we can do, though, is, for instance, with the tribe, one thing that's come up is in our carbon farm planning process. We have started to see, this just happened in the last few weeks, actually, that some of the work to put in like a natural resource conservation service hedgerow to be defining the plant palette from the needs of the tribe. So what does the tribe need for their basketry plants? And what does the tribe need for medicine? And making sure that we substantiate access points to those plants at any point, so that, I don't know if you've heard of the term usufruct, but it's what the indigenous communities used to, basically, if you tend it, you have access. That's why private property never made sense, right? Because if you don't own something and not tend it, you only have access if you're continually tending it. So what's interesting is the native tribes that we've worked with have said, don't just put plants on the ground if you're not going to tend them. Like, don't put culturally relevant plants out there for our sake unless we can access them, or even you can access them. It's about everyone tending land. So putting carbon back in the soil Leah Penniman writes about that in her book, like the idea that you're restoring soil, regardless of your ethnic background, is a very important anti-colonial effort. And then also, and that is the core of our work. It's to literally restore carbon in soils. But I do think like culturally relevant plant life has been missing. And so we're starting to look at how to do that. But I think that the West is very complicated because African American communities were not welcomed during the gold rush. We have very little ownership of land by African or Black farmers, African American or Black farmers. Our history in California that we need to contend with is immigration that has been going on before California became a state, that people have been moving up from Central America into California, harvesting plant life based on changes in latitude and elevation changes. People follow plant harvests for millennia. And the issue that I think that we can deal with is how is California dealing with farm workers and visas? And how are we navigating this idea of people coming here and calling them illegal? Like that's what California needs to grapple with as much as anything. I think every part of the country has a very specific narrative related to what kind of forced labor was occurring. Every part of the country has a specific history, and ours is very unique. It's not like the East Coast, and it's not like the Southeast. It's very, we got our own fish to fry.
And in a way, that's a wonderful point, because it goes back to what you were saying earlier about regenerative agriculture in general. We need to do that. It's not just on what practices you do that need to be place specific, but even in looking into the history and origins of the place and colonization and immigration and those shifts over time, that needs to be done on an individualized, unique level. And so the responses will vary depending on where you are as well.
Well encapsulated, yes, absolutely. And the last thing I'll say about the Japanese farmers in California during the World War II situation, I actually took care of a gentleman who had Alzheimer's, and he was just early onset Alzheimer's. But when I was taking care of him in college, he was a green revolution. If you know what the green revolution, it's like America developing the chemicals and the machinery that they exported to the world to industrialize and scale agriculture. He was one of the brain children of the green revolution. And I went to a land grant university, and he was a huge force, Francis Dubois, and he said he was on the war board during World War II. And the decision to intern Japanese farmers was something that he had access to, that knowledge. He literally said there were two options that were put forward. They were going to send Japanese community members who were in the United States, who were citizens, back to Japan, but they were going to sink the ship. He literally said that they were going to sink the ship. Or we could intern them. And so the war board that he was a member of voted to intern. But he got wind of the fact that all of their rice farms were going to be available. And so he literally purchased huge amounts of rice production at that time and accrued massive wealth as one of California's largest rice farmers. So California has a really horrid history around rice production and the treatment of Japanese communities, farming communities during World War II. And when I learned that, I was just shocked, and I learned it directly from a source. So I think we have many layers of complexity and repair. And yes, there were reparations provided very minimally to Japanese communities, but nothing has been returned in terms of rice farms. Those rice farms have not gone back into the hands of the original families, still to this day. So,
miles to go, lots of work to do. There's a question here from Tristan. How do you reconcile arguments that farming should be for food only? Do you ever get pressure on that point? How do you respond to it, for food security, et cetera?
Yes, we do. And I would just say that it's very important for integrated systems. The two ways that we solve for that is a lot of the plants or animals are part of a bigger food fiber history or tradition. Like, so in the cotton system, most of the money actually from the gins is made by selling the seed to dairy cattle. They need a source of protein. So cotton is very intertwined with dairy production, highly intertwined with dairy production. Flax is could be more intertwined even than it is now because of some of the degumming and retting technologies. You could have flax for seed and truly make a textile. It may not be the highest quality textile, but it could be done. Hemp has similar multiple uses, and sheep, of course, are part of, if you do eat meat, they're part of a lamb and wool production system. And then I think I spoke to this earlier, I'm very focused on integrated crop livestock systems. So how you actually bring the sheep in to replace the use of Roundup, how you keep sheep on croplands instead of putting them out into rangelands that might be grazed by natural or existing wild herbivores. You know, there's our argument is basically like stack functions on existing ag land to make those ag lands more productive through a rotation with a fiber crop or an integration of a fiber animal.
I'm curious about KPIs, key performance indicators, or kind of metrics, or like how would you look at or track the success of a attempt to head towards regeneration in a fiber system or an integrated agriculture system, as you're talking about? Like, what are the key? Do you look at greenhouse gas emissions? Do you look at soil carbon? Do you track biodiversity? What do you think you would kind of hone in on to look in a holistic way at regenerative?
We're primarily looking at actually two things. One is a producer farmer's commitment to practicing, which we measure by meeting with them on like a key performance indicator is a consistent relationship to practicing, meaning not a hands off, but hands more on and on every year. So that's a physical in-person meeting, checking in on this carbon farm plan to see, have you implemented? So very practice-based, a key performance indicator based on their commitment to practice. The other is carbon. We do direct measurement, but we don't use the direct measurement that we do because we go down to 45 centimeters depth. And really to understand carbon sequestration, you would want to do more extensive pit digging, go down a meter deep, do some more advanced and very expensive analysis to really know that a farmer is truly sequestering additional carbon. And then there's a certain permanence level, you know, even though carbon's cycling, but a certain level of permanence or additionality. And the cost of that is huge. I mean, it could, from one of the larger ranches, it could cost us hundreds of thousands of dollars to just test. So what we do instead of that is we do surface level testing of depth down to 45, and we let the producer get those results. And we use it as a kind of a gentle feedback loop for the producer to know if they're tending in the right direction, but we don't make it a contingency for their participation in our climate beneficial program, because what we do use is computer modeling. So or peer-reviewed science that's been done in a landscape nearby that shows if you do this drawdown will occur. And so we've been using modeling and peer review corollary, but we, again, just due to cost and time, I'm not sure we can scale this work globally by doing meter deep pits at every farm in the world.
Yep.
To know that they're sequestering carbon.
There's some cool stuff coming that's on the way that's using spectroscopy deeper down in the soil where you could just insert a probe and get some readings, but a lot of calibration to do on that. And we're hoping it comes because it'll make everything faster for carbon measurement.
Oh, that's wonderful. Is that part of Cornell, or is that a different
There's
technology?
a couple different outfits. There's an independent company out of France. There's the Yale Quick Carbon team. So they're working on it.
That would help him hugely, and that would really get us. But then again, if you have drought, or if you have conditions outside your control, a farmer could lose more carbon in 1 year than was gained, and then in every 3 years, it could show up in their 3 to 5 year check-in. And So some of the climate chaos that we're experiencing can make it hard for farmers to stabilize that carbon. So we're going to have to get really, well, we just have a lot of work to do. We have to get very, very nifty and clever about all that.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly it. Well, thank you everyone for joining today. If you'd like to get in touch with Rebecca, go check out Fibershed. And you can also shoot an email. I'm easy to contact through. How good. Thanks everybody for coming, and we're gonna sign off. Bye.
Thank you so much.